So, thank you, everybody. So, before I begin, I'd like to mention that this presentation was originally delivered at the National Taiwan University in Taipei. My participation was made possible thanks to the financial support of the Loop program, for which I'm very grateful. So, let me just say thank you before I begin. Also, originally, that presentation was given entirely in French, but I didn't want anyone that is not a French speaker to feel left out. So whenever possible, I try to find English equivalents whenever necessary. I apologize in advance if my translations leave something to be desired. Okay? So, as you can see from the first slide, the case study will be toujours, tout, temps, and encore. Those are very commonly used French adverbs, okay? That roughly translate in English as always, all the time, and still, okay? So this conference was given last month, 2 months ago, actually, in April, at the Taiwan Regional Congress. Okay, the university was called NTU. It's National Taiwan University. Roughly put, is the equivalent of Todai for the Taiwanese students. Okay, so let me begin the first slide. So today my presentation would be structured as followed. Okay, I'll take a few minutes to talk about synonymy. Okay, I'll give a very short definition. Then I'll spend some more time on the case study, which are the adverbs I mentioned before, toujours, tout le temps, and encore. I'll then mention briefly the theoretical frameworks from which this theory derives. And more importantly for us all, I'll spend some more time on my fourth section, which are devoted to what we can do in a classroom. Then I'll talk about the semantic discrimination tools that we as foreign language teachers can use. Okay. I'll then mention some exercises and classroom activities that pertain to that subject. And finally, I'll give you some of the feedback I received after giving that presentation in a Taiwanese context. Okay, so the teacher's dilemma. Okay, when learners ask about meaning, I must say that even though I do hold a PhD in cognitive semantics, originally, when I first started my career as a French language instructor, I had barely a master's degree to my name. And the reason why I went into academia is because more often than not, students will come to me during class or after class asking me what's the difference between this and that expression. And sadly, I didn't have any answers to give them. So to get better at my job, I thought it would be a good idea to go into academia and to study linguistics and more specifically semantics, which I did. Okay. So that got me thinking about synonymy. Okay. Total or partial synonymy. Okay. When we talk about different expressions, okay, we usually say that they are synonyms. But in fact, when we say synonyms, we don't talk about total synonymy, which actually never actually exists, but more about partial synonymy. For example, in English, if I were to say husband or spouse, obviously those two words have very similar meanings, yet they have very different usage patterns, and their context of use is different. Okay, so whenever students come out to you as a teacher, ask what's the difference, they may be synonyms, but there is always a difference in meanings. And one of our roles as teachers is being able to, explain the difference. Okay. So being obviously academic in nature, when faced with such a challenge, my first response was to turn to linguistics and linguistic literature, okay, on the subject of synonymy. Okay, that brings me to my second section, what linguistics can tell us about semantic contrast. Okay, Bear in mind that I will talk about those three adverbs I mentioned earlier, toujours, tout le temps, and encore, but I'll mention the different other examples, okay? As I said before, I like to give this presentation in English, so I will be giving English equivalents whenever possible, okay? So let me repeat that toujours, tout le temps, and encore usually translate as always, all the time, and still in English. Okay, so what linguistics can tell us about meanings? Okay, so let's take an example about toujours. Right? Toujours, as I said before, is usually translated as always in English. Okay, it has to do with aspect. Okay, it has different aspectual values, and for example, it can be iterative, which means that when you say, for example, Japanese trains are always on time, its aspectual value is embedded. Okay. It could also be a derivative, okay? When you say in English, the door is always closed, okay? I'm not going to go through all the usage patterns for toujours, okay? I numbered about 8 or 9 of them. I don't want my presentation to be about all that. Suffice it to say that it's a non-exhaustive overview, and that just like in the English always, there are many, many ways you can use that particular word, and for each context, it has a special meaning, okay? So, what is aspect? Okay, that's one thing that may not be clear for some of us that are not that haven't studied linguistics. Here's very short definition we can give about aspect. It's what language makes visible about the unfolding of an event. Okay, if I were to go back to the two earlier examples, when I say the door is always closed, in French, la porte est toujours fermée, then it's a derivative aspect. Whereas when I say Japanese trains are always on time, obviously I'm not talking about one specific train, but different trains. So the same event is being repeated continuously, which give it iterative aspect. Okay, so that's what we call aspect in linguistics. It's a very important operational concept, and we use it to analyze synonyms all the time. Okay, especially aspect synonyms such as always, all the time, and so forth. Okay. Okay, but here's when it gets tricky. When you think about toujours, okay, and you make a list of all these possible aspectual values, you realize very rapidly that tout le temps, encore, which are all the time still, have also have an overlap. Okay, so sometimes it's okay to say toujours, but you could also say tout le temps, which means all the time. So that pattern, the aspectual value for each adverb is not enough to be able to differentiate the different patterns of use. Okay, so we got back where we started. So I thought, well, since aspect is not very useful, maybe there are other analytical tools and operational concepts we can use. So I went back to the linguistic literature and did some digging. Okay, we talked about aspect. Okay, it can be derivative, iterative, resultative, but there are other operational concepts that we can use to differentiate different patterns of use. For example, semantic features. It's a bit of a given, but if you're being asked by one of your students, what's the difference between a stallion and a mare? Obviously, both are horses, but one of them is male, the other is female. Okay, the semantic features. The only things that changes between those two words are one semantic feature, which is gender. Okay. Obviously, there are other operational frameworks, such as presupposition implicatures, because there's a difference between John smokes and John stopped smoking. One sentence implies that he used to smoke, while the other doesn't do that. It just states the present state of affairs. Okay, you have also connotation and denotation, cognitive domains, and so forth. So I'll skim over those. The only reason I'm presenting them today is to say that even though those optional concepts are very useful as researchers in linguistics, they are sadly of very little use as teachers when we are faced with the dilemma presented earlier, which is whenever a student asks us what's the difference between those two expressions, obviously you should not talk about aspect. Aspect is a very complex concept and cannot be understood by the average Japanese student. Even though, and I might have the opportunity to go back to that later, Japanese language relies heavily on aspect. That's how most of his temporal tenses are being expressed. Okay, oh, somebody moved. Hang on. Let me go back to the other screen. So as I said before, those operational concepts are very little use for us as teachers. So more importantly, this is going to be the longest part of my presentation. I'm going to come up and give you a few pointers that we could use as teachers, okay? So this section is called a practical reflective framework. It's a very AI way of saying that those are semantic discrimination tools for teachers, okay? When you're teaching, either English or French, and you're being asked a question, and you have a split second to come up with an answer, here are some of the guiding questions you can use, okay? Over the years, I've been teaching for 25 years. The first question I always ask myself is about the medium. Does that particular word or expression belongs to the written world, or is it more used conversationally? Okay, and that first question usually gives me a very good answers, and that leads me to language registers. Okay, for example, is it colloquial, formal, neutral? When do we use it? I mentioned earlier the difference between spouse and husband. Obviously, spouse is a lot more formal. We don't use it in conversation. This is one of the first information you can give your students, okay? You don't have to go through a lengthy explanation. You just say, well, you don't really use it in a conversation. What you need to know is husband. Spouse is more formal. We use it when you fill out a form somewhere at your district or whatever, okay? Also, another question is, what is a recurring context? Which means that, for example, if you're being asked in English, what's the difference between amongst and amid? Okay, it's a bit tricky. So as a native English speaker, you can always ask yourself, okay, if I use amongst, what do I use it with? Okay, obviously, one of the first examples that could come to your mind is, I'd say amongst the trees, yet I would say amid the fog. Okay, the linguistic literature tells us that amongst refers to an environment that is heterogeneous, okay, comprised of several distinct entities, whereas amid is used to refer to an environment that's homogeneous. So that's why it's amid the fog and among the trees, okay? Obviously, I'm not saying that you should go through that explanation while presenting the difference, but you can very easily, take a pencil and write, I don't know, maybe some kind of fog or cloud-looking schematic on a board, write a medium bit in the middle, and write a few sticks that represents trees, and write amongst underneath. That would be definition enough. Okay. The rule, whenever we ask a question, is to be as clear and concise as possible. If your definition is too long, you're going to lose your audience. Okay. We can talk about how to present such answers later on, but this is my rule, my cardinal rule, I must say. Also, let's talk about implicit. Okay, instead of going through a definition, okay, and you can always present your answer by showing the underlying question. Okay, let's say a student asks you, what's the difference between saying I'm single and I'm not married? Obviously, they mean the same thing, but the underlying question is different. Okay, I'm single. Implicitly comes into answer the question, what's your marital status? Whereas I'm not married is answering the question that is, are you married? Okay, so instead of going through a definition, okay, you write the answer, the question, the underlying question that particular expression is answering. Okay, so that's a lot easier than going through a definition. Also, thinking in terms of opposite. Okay, if a question asks you what's the difference between far and remote, okay, obviously there are synonyms. Yet the polar opposite of far would be near, whereas the polar opposite of remote would be easily accessible. So thinking in terms of opposites is actually sometimes a bigger help for our students. Okay. Also, something very useful is the connotation. Okay, is it positive or negative? For example, if you were to call someone stubborn, that would be different than calling her persistent. Persistent neutral might be a quality, whereas stubborn clearly has a negative connotation to it, okay? So if you can see, all those guiding questions, okay, apply differently according to whatever synonyms you're being asked about, okay? I wouldn't recommend you going through all of them while explaining something, because as I said before, and that's not written in my presentation, but it's in another of my cardinal rules, I always, whenever I'm being asked questions, I try to speak as little as possible. Because the 25 years of teaching, I realized that the more you speak, the less you are being listened to, and the more you explain, the less you are being understood. So keep it simple, keep it concise. And the students don't need to know the whole story, the whole definition, okay? Just giving them one clear cut, patterns of use. This is negative. This is positive. This is formal. This is for, that particular expression comes in answer to that question. That's enough. Okay? That's how I would explain things. So that's what I do on my part. Okay? What do students do clearly in my classroom? Okay. So here are some classroom activities for exploring near synonymy. Okay? So as a general rule, only deal with pairs of expressions. To reduce cognitive overload, I don't do more than two. So my case study is actually a wrong example because it deals with three adverbs. Ideally, I'll take only two and focus on those two. If you come up with three things, just make the whole thing way too complex. Okay, so to reduce cognitive overload, only deal with two things at once. Okay, also, I try to foster collaborative work, which is I make students work in pairs and small groups. Three, for me, is a magic number, okay? I'll give you an example of why it's so good. The thing is, when they work in pairs, if they disagree, well, democracy can't work, so they're stuck. Usually, when they work in threes, two of them at least got the right answer, and the third one goes, well, maybe it must be right, and that's it. Four, the fourth one is sleeping, okay? Three is the magic number. Collaborative work, three is the magic number for anything, okay? So, what you can do, obviously, you can ask them to come up with answers to the guiding questions I mentioned earlier, but also there are graphs and visual aids that can be used. And well, I'll mention some more classroom activities that we find in textbooks, but here's what I do use as visual aid, okay? So here another example. Okay, let's say that a student asks you what's the difference between désormais and dorénavant. It's a very tricky question. When I look for a translation, I found from now on and henceforth. Okay, obviously henceforth is a little bit more formal. Okay, but there is more to it. Okay, so here's a visual aid. Okay, write down a graph. Okay, with two axes. Okay, and I ask my students. Okay, work in threes. Okay, place those two words on the graph, okay? Obviously, one is more prescriptive, the other is more descriptive, one is more volitional, the other is more constative. Obviously, let me say something right off the bat. I don't use those words in my classes. Those are way too complex. But you can use something simple. You go strict, not strict, or statement, not statement. That's easy enough. Or neutral, not neutral, okay? And those two or three students will work together. You talk it over possibly in Japanese, if possible. But for those who are willing to go the extra mile, I always provide them with a typical sentence you can use. Okay, I've given it here. So A and B would go, for me, that particular word belongs more around here. What about you? Well, I would place it more over there. So I give them the tools to, whenever I'm teaching French, to use French as a tool to learn and explore difficulties that pertain to the French language. Okay, obviously that depends on how good they are, their language skills, but whenever possible, I try to give them the tools to explain themselves in the target language as well. Okay. So we're not only talking about, the content, but also whenever the expression arises, I'll give them some pointers to explain themselves. Okay. So here's an example. Another another thing I'd like to remark on that particular graph, as you can see, there is no figures. okay? The reason why I don't put 10, 15, 60% is because more than, let's say, I think it was 35 years ago when I first started to learn English, I asked my then teacher, what's the difference between perhaps and maybe? Okay. And what she came up with an answer. She said, well, perhaps you use it when there is a 50-50% chance, whereas maybe is more like a 25% chance of that particular event occurring. Okay, that sounded good enough. But then I said, so is it raining tomorrow? And if you were to look on your phone and you find there is a 40% chance of precipitation, then what word should I use? Okay, so that's why I don't use figures. It's all about compared to what each other, what is more likely. Okay, so you don't give absolute answers in terms of, you don't use figures, you just add them to compare the different values. I think that's how it works best. Because bear in mind that whenever we speak a language, we as native speakers, we don't stick to the truth. We only present our version of reality. Okay, if I think it's more likely to rain than you, then I'd say maybe perhaps, whereas you might say maybe. Okay, if you're maybe optimistic about the upcoming picnic you're supposed to have, you say, well, it may be raining. Whereas if you say that maybe it sounds like it's going to rain, you say, perhaps it's going to rain. Okay. I call this graph the Cartesian coordinate system of semantic nuances. I've just come up with that term. It doesn't exist in literature yet, so don't look for it. It's my own personal creation, but I like it because it speaks to my scientific nature. Okay, so this is the type of visual aid I use. So obviously I do more exercises you can find in popular text room. Okay, to go back to the guiding questions, the guiding questions, whereas what's the underlying questions? Okay, let's say that a student asks you what's the difference between aucun and pas de. In English, they usually translate as known and any. Okay, so do you say known or any? Well, clearly, if you ask how many French friends do you have, and do you have any French friends? Okay. If the answer is zero, okay, obviously you'd say known when reply to the first question. How many French friends do you have? Known, as in zero. Do you have any French friends? More of an open question. Say, no, I don't have any, and that's it. Okay. This is how you can, by proposing a matching exercises, you are actually dealing with the underlying question. Okay. This was one of the guiding questions I mentioned earlier. Okay. So also you have gap fill text. This one came up with that one when I was writing a column for NHK. They asked for something very classic, something that the Japanese audience would be comfortable with. Okay, so it's sounds easy, but the trick is to find a very explicit sentence that would obviously refers to only one particular kind of context. Okay, that would only enable one answer, because whenever you do a gap fill text, okay, if you say, well, you can say both, but they don't mean the same thing, that particular classroom activities is useless. Worse, it's actually counterproductive because it adds even more difficulty to the problem the student was having in the first place. So whenever you're designing such exercises, it has to be foolproof. Only one acceptable answer should be allowed. Okay. What this is either or exercise, the same thing, except it's easier because they don't have to write down the things, just have to pick the right one. Okay, this is the difference between voir and regarder. Well, in English it's even harder because you have watch, see, and look. So those are three words. I'm guessing if you're teaching English, you must, especially to beginners, you must spend a lot of time explaining what the differences are, because the Japanese has mieru and miru, but it's not quite the same. Okay. Here another example. So to go back to my case study. Okay. Once I've explored near-synonymy, when I've given my students guiding questions, and we've done those all the classroom activities I mentioned up to the exercises I mentioned earlier. I always think it's nice to finish with some translations. Okay, so you're a native Japanese speaker. How would you say that in Japanese? Okay. And usually, for example, for toujours, it translates as itsumo. So even if they don't know exactly how it works, since they have the Japanese equivalent, there's no problem for them because they don't know what exactly itsumo means either. They just use it naturally because it's automatic. Okay. But sometimes, once in a blue moon, they have a different translation. For example, pas encore, as in not yet, translate usually as mada. And it's nice to know that to each context and to each pattern of use, usually there is a Japanese translation that differs, and to be able to link those two languages together, it's called linguistics mediation. I think it's a very useful tool for students, okay? Because if they're being trained to go back and forth between the target language and their own language, they get a feeling of, they become more independent as learners. Okay, so here's another translation exercise. So they have to come up with typical exercises, okay, and typical translations, which are, well, here's a few examples. And once again, sometimes you find very interesting patterns. For example, let's say il se plaint tout le temps, it's number 4. Roughly translated in English means, oh, he complains all the time, okay? Here, you won't use an aspect adverb. You use, like in Japanese, 彼は文句ばっかり言ってます. Okay, and the bakkari is emotionally pregnant. It has a lot of it. There's a lot of negative connotation to it, and that I think is very important because they can relate to the target language on an emotional level. Because tout le temps and all the time usually has a negative connotation. Okay, when you say somebody works all the time, you mean that he works too often, and being able to find something that's an equivalent in their own native language, makes it more important and enables them to actually remember it easier. Okay, so lesson from Taiwanese experience. This will be the last part of my presentation. So here's a couple of feedbacks I got while giving this presentation. Okay, more often than not, okay, we talked about how the Taiwanese students were similar, different to Japanese students, and I'm very happy to report that they're pretty much the same. I mean, whatever problems they were having, we had the same. Many students are glued to their smartphone during class. Many students take very little initiative. They don't speak, and they tend to over-prioritize grammar over pronunciation and communicative practice. Okay, I must say I felt bad for my colleagues at Taiwanese University, but I was very happy that whatever problems I had in my classroom had nothing to do with me, which means that, well, maybe it's an Asian thing, but Taiwanese students, even if it's very good high university, pretty much are the same as the one we have here. Okay, maybe we can talk about that later on during the Q&A session. Okay. Here's, as that was going to be my last slide, the feedback I got after my presentation. Overall, everybody liked the dynamic aspect of the approach, but I was once criticized by one person in attendance because you don't have the whole speech here, but one of the person in attendance asked me, guiding questions doesn't sound like enough, okay? At some point, you need to go into more lengthy explanation or definition. To which I said, no, I disagree, because more often than not, the students that come up with the question don't have the sufficient language skills to actually understand and benefit from my explanation. So sometimes I flatly refuse to give an explanation when I think that whatever I might say might only add to the obstacle you created for yourself. Okay, that was the one negative criticism I got during that presentation, but I'm happy to discuss it further during the Q&A sessions. Okay, that will conclude my presentation for today. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I would be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.